You know, you've had yourself a very successful morning here. Killed yourself a really nice white-tailed doe, but now the work begins. First of all, before we start this field dressing, or you start to field dress your deer, leave on your hunter orange. Don't take it off. It makes you identifiable, so do that. Number two is, be sure that you've met the requirements as far as your state tagging is concerned. Now in my state, it says what I have to do, I have to have my permit signed, and it's signed. And then of course on the back of that, there's the information on the kill. Here, what I'm gonna have to do is I cross out here or punch out, cut it out, whatever. I cancel the female, I cancel November, and I cancel the 14th. Now that cancels this permit and makes it the tag. This permit and tag combination has to stay with the animal. If I'm with it, I can carry it. If I leave the animal, I have to leave this tag or permit with the animal. But be sure and check your state regulations so you're not violating the law. The next thing is be sure and wear rubber gloves. Now, one thing about rubber gloves, they sure keep your hands good and clean. You don't have the mess when you get done cleaning the deer. But also, it's just a good precaution on account of disease. You know, we have the chronic wasting disease here in the state in the Panhandle, and we've had occasional show-ups in other parts of the state. It's just a good precaution. You know, we don't have any evidence that humans can even get chronic wasting disease, but still, there's just a lot we don't know about it, so it's just a good precaution. Wear rubber gloves. You know, the first thing when you get to field dressing this deer we're going to have to do is break into the body cavity. Now, there are a couple of ways you can do this, and you make up your own mind at how you want to do it. But you can start right at the brisket with your cut into that cavity. If you're going to do that, be sure that the head end of the deer is uphill a little bit, because then the pressure of the intestines won't be working against you. Or you can do like we're going to do here. We're going to go into the anus here, into the vent, and we're going to start from the back end of this deer. Now, in order to do that, you'd like to have the head down just a little bit, because then that pressure is the other way for you. Well, let's get started. First thing we're going to do is cut around the urinary opening here. We're going to go in here, make a cut, and just through the skin. We're going to go down here and around the vent here. We'll just make this cut, get around the vent. We're going to come back up here and do the same thing on this side. Cut around, a little difficult, but be sure when you're doing this, try to keep your knife under the skin. Now I'll tell you why. Because if you're cutting from above, you're going to get hair in that meat. And one thing you don't want when you're cleaning that meat up and butchering and cutting your own up or whatever you do, you don't need a lot of hair in that meat. But now we've got that done. Now, what we've got to do is trim this urinary tract a little bit right here, get it started in there. The one thing you want to be very cautious of here is you don't want to cut a hole in the bladder. And the bladder is right up here close. So when you start this cut around here, be sure and keep your knife pointed out like this and keep it out of that urinary tract and go in there pretty deep when you make that cut. Cut around that so it's free. Be sure and keep your knife pointed out. You understand what I mean? Pointed out this way into the bone, because then you can't be poking holes in anything. Saw around that and cut it plenty free. Don't worry about that going in there too far, but keep the blade pointed out into the bone. You can feel that as you're cutting. Now, the urinary tract, you want to be awful cautious, like I say, because that bladder is right here, right in this opening. But get that cut free. See how I'm pulling on that? And then when you run your knife in here, be sure that you're staying on the outside of the pelvis. Run your knife blade out. Keep the blade into the bone. And that way you're not going to poke a hole in the intestines. See what I'm doing there? I'm keeping that knife right out against the side of the pelvis. Try not to cut toward yourself. Now, we've probably got that free enough that it's going to pull in for us when we decide to go. Now, the next thing we want to do here is we want to pull that out there, and we're going to tie this off. We're going to take a string and tie that off. Take a little piece of nylon like this, and I tie a slip knot in it, because this is pretty slick stuff to handle. Pull that in there and be sure you got the vent up through there. And when you get that, then pull this up tight, that slip knot. When you get that pulled in there tight, then I just tie another little knot in here to make sure that that slip knot stayed. Now I've got that tied off so that when we pull the entrails inside, no manure or urine can run out of there. Now if this were a buck deer, you'd start the same way. You'd tie off the vent here, but this cut's going to be a little different. We're going to start in down here, and we're going to cut up to the testicles. And once we get up there, then we're going to trim those out, cut around them like this. And you're going to notice that the urinary tract then We broke some there. You can see that came up through there. But you notice this year and kind of went out on the hair. It really didn't get on the meat. But if that should happen, be sure and clean that off. Wipe it off, wash it off. But the other thing is be sure and clean that knife off and get it good and disinfected. But the urinary tract goes right back down to the groin area. See how it does? Goes right back down through the groin area. Be careful when you make this cut, because you notice here I've cut into the meat here. But cut that clear back to the groin, and then when we pull the intestines in, when we make this other cut, that'll pull in with the anus. At this stage in the game, it might be good to remind you that every once in a while you want to disinfect that blade. You know, we've entered that deer in kind of an unsightly area, and I laid the knife on the ground. I carry handy wipes with me, generally an alcohol base or a Lysol. You can even take water and mix it with some Clorox. A little tablespoon of Clorox in a gallon of water is all you need. Keep that knife cleaned off. Now we return to this vent area here, and we're going to make a cut right up here. Now remember I told you keep your knife underneath, and the reason you're going to do that is because you want to keep that hair out of that meat, and you can do that by simply keeping your blade under. Now we're just going to cut through the skin. You can skin around this, the udder, if you want to. I'm not going to in this case. I'm going to cut right through it. And sometimes a doe deer will still be carrying milk, and you'll see that. And then I just walk that right forward so you don't poke holes in the intestines. But we'll do some trimming here and cut this out around here, because right here is where we're going to make our entry into this chest cavity, into this abdominal cavity. Right here is the groin area. We're going to make a cut there, and right here, and right here, and there's going to be a lot of pressure right here. Now here's where you don't want to cut into the intestines, and this is where I'm going to switch blades. I'm going to go from this blade to what they call a gutting blade, and you can see how that's made. It's got a little round thing on there. That keeps you from poking a hole in the intestines. You can stick that up under there and just kind of saw your way right up through there and not have to worry about poking a hole in the intestine. See what I'm talking about? And we're going to take this clear up to the brisket here. Just like that. And now we haven't poked a hole in the intestines at all, or the stomach or anything. All right, there you are. Now we've come to this point here with this kind of a blade. If you don't have this kind of a blade, lay your two fingers in here like this and put your cutting blade in between there so the point isn't exposed, and you can just start clear back here and just walk that right up so that you don't poke any holes in the intestines, and that'll work for you. But these little blades are handy. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to continue on up here, and I'm going to open this deer up to here. Then I'm going to switch blades again because I need to go back to my cutting blade. And I'm going to kind of clean this brisket off here. I'm just going to make some cuts here just to kind of clean the fat and get me down to the brisket. Hear that bone? You can hear it. I'm right down to it. And now what I'm going to do, here's another thing you might want to carry. You can cut this brisket with a knife. It's kind of a chore, but in this little knife, it also has a little saw blade. And all I have to do, and it's rounded here so it won't poke hole in the guts, all I have to do is just start up through that brisket like this. You want to cut that far enough forward that those front legs kind of fall out to the side, and you've got plenty of opportunity then to get into the chest cavity. And in order to do that, you've got to get right clear up front of the brisket. You will tell when you get there because it'll fall right open. This needs to be cut pretty much clear up here because we're wanting to open this up. So be sure to open this chest cavity up, right up under his throat there, or her throat. See how that opens up then? Okay, now the next thing I want to draw your attention to here is the diaphragm. The diaphragm lays in between the heart and the lung area. The liver's right behind it and all the intestines. It's what separates, it's what lets that deer breathe. And this needs to be cut out of there because that's what attaches the front end. So you want to start with your knife here and keep real close to the rib cage and just trim that. And you've got to go clear down. You need to roll that deer over and cut that clear down to the backbone. Same on this side then. You're not going to be able to see that too good, but cut that diaphragm clear around. Get that cut free. And then when you get that cut free, the next thing you need to do, and this will be pretty much disconnect the intestines, and that is cut the trachea here. Now this here has been shot up here in the throat, but that trachea is right here. Just be sure you get that cut off right there. Can you see that? And that's tough. It's tough to cut. So, but saw it off, and you can pull that right on back. See there? And you might have to trim a little here. It's hooked on. But the other thing I want to tell you is on this trachea, if you're going to hang this deer and let it age or anything, be sure and cut this deer on up, skin that out, and take that trachea out. That's one place the meat will spoil. One thing that's helpful here is a stick to prop this open, and just kind of helps you to hold that so you can see in there what you're doing. Now I'm going to hook onto this. We've got a little blood here, a little trauma, but I'm going to pull like this, and there's still some place here where that diaphragm hasn't cut free, and so I'm going to have to cut that, see? I'll lift up on this side. Can you see where it's kind of hooked there, the fat and stuff, and get that cut. Now you want to be careful when you get to this point, because in this meat, inside here are the little back straps, what they call. Right here, see them? You don't want to cut those up too much because they're pretty good eating. So I just pull this free and cut the fat and pull those intestines out on the other side. This deer's fat, good deer. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go down the other end here, and we're going to free up that intestinal tract and pull that back inside the deer now. Now you remember when we started, we cut the vent and the urinary tract here free, and we tied that string on, and now we're just going to pull that inside, see there? And then we're just going to roll the intestines out, and we're done with that deer. It's a nice deer. For all practical purposes, this deer is already field dressed. We've got the entrails out and everything. And now next thing I'm going to do is, of course, we've got some trauma in there. We got some blood. I'm going to lift this deer up here and get her head uphill so that drains out. It don't take much. Starting to drain out right now. We'll probably take a paper towel too and just kind of dry it out a little bit. Now you can either do that, or you can roll this deer over with his chest cavity out if the ground is good and clean, if you're not going to get a bunch of bad stuff in the meat. If you got a 40-degree day, you can leave the hide on. It'll probably cool soon enough. If you don't, get that skin off and get it protected. Get the meat protected so it doesn't get dirty. But don't leave it lay on the ground, because that meat on the ground is insulated and it'll sour quick. If the heart and liver are something you want to save, here's a little clue. The heart is sometimes kind of hard to find, but actually it's right in between the lungs, and it's in a little placenta. Just poke a hole in that, like I'm doing with my knife here, and that heart will just slip right out of there. See there? Boy, this deer's got a nice heart. Now trim that off. You can be careful with that, or you don't have to be too much. It's just, that's what you're going to wind up with right there. And I always put that in a bag. I sometimes put it in a cloth bag, simply because the cloth will breathe a little bit and makes it cool a little quicker, but I'm going to bag that. Now, if you want to save the liver, it lays right there. Just be sure that what you do when you cut the liver out of that, be sure not to cut into the gall, because the gall is one of the little bile, or the bile rather, not the gall. The bile is right there on the head end of that liver, and you don't want that in that meat. So cut out around that a little bit. I don't know whether you can see that very good, but you can see how the liver lays there, and you'll know when you pick it out of there, you can tell how to cut it. Do not eat the meat if the organs smell bad, if they exhibit greenish discharge, have blood clots, or are discolored. One thing I might address here too, the lymph nodes in a deer are similar to our body. They're in the fatty tissue areas, so when you're cleaning the deer, of course the lymph nodes will come out some with the intestines, but there are going to be lymph nodes left in that deer. Now here are a couple of lymph nodes that came from the deer's throat area, and they're generally enlarged in the kind of the fatty tissue. So when you clean your deer, be sure that you check that fatty area and get all those lymph nodes out of there. These are pretty good sized. Some of those in the tissue here in the ham area here will be smaller, but if you find one that's any bigger than this, if it's twice, 3 times that size, then I think I would be suspect of the meat of that animal. I don't know that I would want to eat it. I'd have it checked for sure. Getting back to the chronic wasting disease issue, just remember this. Don't cut into or consume the brain, spinal cord, spleen, or lymph nodes. And remember this, removal of all the fat from the meat will remove the lymph nodes also. When you're done with this deer and it's cut up and ready for the fridge, you're going to have the carcass. Be sure you dispose that carcass in whatever manner your state requires. Well, it's time to get this old girl home and get her cut up for the freezer. Just remember this, one of the important things is to keep that meat cool. You can pack this cavity with snow, you can stop and get some ice, get it iced down, but keep the meat cool. It'll make better table fare.
Deer hunters that have had a successful hunt are faced with the question of how to process the carcass into meat cuts. These cuts will be consumed by their family and friends, and so there's some level of concern in the process. Some hunters may choose to have this deer processed by a custom or commercial deer processor in their area. However, others may choose to process a deer by themselves. This may especially be important if your deer was harvested from an area where chronic wasting disease is a concern. Your home processing can also add a level of assurance for disease and safety, as cross-contamination from other deer can occur, and the safety of the meat now is in your control. Some hunters may enjoy doing the job by themselves and also to save the dollars from commercial processing. Therefore, the purpose of this video is to demonstrate a process that fully debones the meat from a deer carcass, and one of the objectives is to remove any potential material that may be involved or associated with chronic wasting disease. This process will differ from traditional ways that we've used to process deer, in that in the traditional, we're going to try and remove the spinal column from the carcass and bone all of the muscle cuts. In the past, we have taken sections of the carcass, such as the round, or the loin, and the rib, and we've used a saw to cut these portions from the carcass, including the shoulder, which has quite a bit of bone, and using square-cut shoulder chops and steaks. And so this method is going to demonstrate how we can take the carcass and fully bone it into individual muscles or groups of muscles that then can be processed. And one of the things that we're going to do is find the key bones and the key areas on the carcass that we can remove muscle segments from, and then further cut those segments down into edible portions or retail cuts of deer or venison. Before we begin the process of cutting the deer into muscle cuts, we certainly want to inspect all parts of the carcass and remove those areas that are damaged, either from the gunshot wounds or other injuries that the deer may have incurred out in the wild or during the hunt. And so removal of all the bloodshot or blood spot areas or bruises that are on the carcass would be a very important step. Sometimes this requires removing a rather large area of meat on the carcass. Hopefully this is in an area of the carcass that is very low value cuts and cuts that are normally not made into retail steaks and roast. In addition, we'd like to look over the carcass after the hide has been removed. Sometimes pieces of hair will remain, and so trimming these from the carcass will allow for better quality meat. And also if there's any dark or dried areas where the deer meat has hung in an open air, that would provide a dark surface. If we'd take our knife and remove these pieces of meat from the carcass, why then we'll come out with a better quality product or better quality muscle cuts in the end. The first segment of the carcass that we're going to remove is to the front leg and shoulder blade area. This is simply done by cutting through a web muscle that attaches from the breast area of the carcass over to the front leg. And once we cut through that muscle, why then there is a seam between the muscles that we should be able to follow and cut back up towards the vertebrae or towards the top of the carcass. And if we stay in that seam, why then remove the leg and a number of muscle groups from the forequarter of the carcass. As we're doing this, we want to examine and be careful there's a lymph node that is present in the prescapular area, or the area right in front of the blade bone, and that lymph node should be removed. And one good recommendation as we're cutting meat from the carcass, if you trim all of the fat and look especially for those glandular material such as lymph nodes, why then we'll produce a safer product as well. Once the front leg is removed, we can get several cuts from this area, or simply just bone out this area for use as trim in ground meat or else we can cut some major muscles off in order to get into some smaller roasts and steaks. If we come in behind where the elbow of the front leg is at and then follow the humerus bone or the arm bone up along with the blade of our knife, we're able to remove the arm muscles from the lower part of the leg. And these set of muscles then can be used as an individual roast, or they may be rather tough to consume, and a lot of people will simply add them to the meat grinding operation as they want to have a certain amount of sausage that they get. Then you need to identify the spine of the blade bone on this front leg and make a cut along that spine to help remove what we would call the top blade portion. Those of you that are familiar with the cattle beef flat iron steak, this is the same muscle system that's used for it. It could be as itself a fairly tender cut of meat if prepared properly, but again, others may decide to include it simply as a source of lean trimmings to make sausage with, as they desire to make a lot of deer sausage. To remove this top blade muscle, we simply cut next to the bone and remove the top of it. The other piece of muscle that is on the other side of that spine is called the tender, and this muscle can be removed by simply cutting along the bone and across the top of the scapula. Then once you've done that, you simply need to clean up the rest of the bones, and you're going to make a lot of lean trimming meat from cleaning up the lean muscle that's remaining on the bones. So once we've completed deboning the front leg, we'll have several cuts of meat that we can identify and use as either roast or retail cuts. And so we have the arm portion, we have the top blade portion, and then the mock tender or the upper part of the blade cuts of meat. This is the arm roast that's removed, and it's a sizable enough roast that it could be utilized individually as a roast. Here is the fillet portions from the top blade meat, and then this is the tender, chuck tender, or the mock tender portion. This piece can sometimes be used as trimming, but also could be cut into small fillets. It could be rather tough without some extra means to tenderize the meat. So we could cut small medallions that could be utilized in a number of ways, but again, many people will simply choose to put it into trimmings for sausage meat. The next thing that we need to do is try and remove what people call the straps or the loins on the carcass. This is done by cutting down along the spinous processes of the vertebral column, and so the spine that sticks up on the backbone is where we want to make our cut down along beside that spine. This, what we're trying to do is avoid cutting into the spinal column itself. On the upper portion, you'll need to locate the point of the hip bone and make a cut across this area to remove the loin. We want to be careful that we don't cut too deeply, because if we cut below the bony process of the spine, why then we're going to cut into the tenderloin muscle on the back side of the carcass. And so care needs to be taken here to find the proper location, and then we need to find those lateral processes like demonstrated here, where the meat lays on top of the lateral process of the spine in order to remove it. Then we also need to make the transition where we go from the lumbar area into the rib area and cut across the top of the ribs. And what we're trying to do is just remove this one big muscle, the major muscle system that is the longissimus dorsi muscle, as the scientific name for it, and pull it out in one whole piece. And it runs all the way from the hip portion of the carcass to down in the neck to where it's about the second or third vertebrae. As we get down into the neck portion, why the size of this muscle starts to change a little bit, and so where you cut it off in the neck probably is not real significant, because you're probably going to end up with some of this meat that goes into lean trimmings rather than into roast. Once you get into the boned out strap, why then the front portion of it near the head is a portion that we're going to cut into roast portions. and then maybe 1 or 2 roasts can be cut out of this area, and then the remainder of the strap will be cut into chops. The roasts are cut because we have a lot of muscles and the size of the eye is very small in there, and then the chops will come from an area of the strap that has much larger muscle system and one individual muscle involved, and makes a very nice looking chop. Fully denuded, it will appear very, very lean in terms of the muscle. For those that desire to have just a little bit larger size on the chop, why we'll take and fillet down through the middle and make what we call a butterfly chop. Would be another way to create more size if you're looking for larger pieces out of this particular section of the strap. So just in review again, this portion is the front portion of the strap, and you can see that the muscles are very small and that we have a number of different muscles entering into this portion of the strap, and so we leave that as a roast. And then as we go back further into the loin, why then we can cut chops that are fairly uniform in size and very, very lean. And if we want them a little bit bigger, why then we butterfly the chops and make a cut that appears to be bigger, but is essentially 2 chops that are folded together and opened like the wings of a butterfly. This is the whole strap, and as with the cuts that we made, we took off the silver skin, and so that silvery shiny material on the outside could be where the fat is at if your deer has fat. It's also the skin, silver skin, that needs to be removed before we make the final cutting. We need to open the flank on the carcass in order to get to the tenderloin muscles that are on the inside of the body cavity. This is in the same location where during the evisceration process you may have pulled out some fat, and obviously the entrails in the field processing of the deer. To remove the tenderloin from the carcass, we're going to cut loose the head of the tenderloin, and then we'll cut down along beside the body of the vertebral column to loosen the tenderloin. This is also an area of the carcass where we can find additional lymph nodes. These lymph nodes may or may not be in the carcass. If a person has cleaned the inside of the carcass of all fat and tissue during the field dressing operation, why then they will not see these lymph nodes in the carcass. But if they are there, those should be removed to help ensure further safety. And again, simply removing the tenderloin by cutting through the very top portion of the tenderloin next to the leg muscles and loosening it, and then coming and down and finding the lateral processes of the vertebra, cutting along the body of the vertebra and the lateral processes, then we can remove this one single muscle, which is actually the psoas major and psoas minor muscles together, the tenderloin, that many of you may recognize from beef cattle terms as the filet mignon, or one of the most tender cuts within the carcass. And so hopefully you can remove this as one whole piece, and you'll end up with a very nice tender cut of meat at the end. Here is the picture of the 2 tenderloins. Usually these would be left whole for cooking. You may want to clean the external silver skin or any blood shots that are on these tenderloins, but I would not cut them into smaller pieces, as they're already small enough. If I were to cook them, I would probably cook them as one whole piece, and then after the cooking cut them into medallions. This is removal. Then we start with removal of the knuckle, or the muscles out of the hind leg, and we're going to focus on 4 muscle systems here. But one of the easiest things to do is to go on the outside of the leg and find the seam that exists between the knuckle muscles, or the quadriceps muscles, and the outside round muscle, or the biceps femoris, on the carcass. And so once that seam is found, why then you get a pretty good idea of where the muscle attaches up in the upper portion of the leg. And we'll open up that seam as best we can in order to make it easier to remove this muscle system. And so at the bottom side, loosen it up. And then we come to the top side, we need to come in behind the kneecap. So this is one place where we're going to pull out a bone with the muscle, and that we're just going to take the patella or the kneecap and remove it as we're going through the boning of the knuckle. This will be some tendinous material there as well, and so once you've found that, why then you can simply knife through the remainder portion of the muscle that's attached to the femur bone or the main leg bone, and you should be able to find seams on both sides that'll pull this muscle system for the quadriceps clean off of the carcass, and then you'll need to cut through the bottom portion to remove the whole piece. Once the knuckle is removed, why then we can focus on the two muscles that involve the outside round. The biceps femoris is the one that's in front, and then just on the back side of it, of the leg, is the semitendinosus. If we start way up at the top of the leg, you'll find a attachment where the muscle is rather thin, and you'll need to find the seam of the muscle that this falls down in through. There's actually a set of muscles that you'll leave on the carcass that we call the heel, and we'll need to do the same thing with the semitendinosus muscle that attaches in pretty close to the hock. And once we find that seam between the semitendinosus and the inside of the leg, why then we can remove that whole muscle system. And so sometimes this presents a little bit of a challenge on finding exactly where you're at. You're not going to make too many mistakes in this area, but this seam between the two muscles then allows us to again follow the bone down, and we'll need to cut the semitendinosus from the top of the pelvic bone, and then the outside round will wrap over the top of the rump of the carcass, and so we'll remove the biceps femoris muscle over the top of this rump portion or the sirloin portion of the carcass, and it comes out in one major muscle piece. After that's done, why then we can proceed to remove the inside round portion, and the inside round is fairly easily seen now that you've removed the outside muscles. The main thing is to loosen it up alongside the leg bone or the femur bone, and then it attaches to the pelvic bone. And the pelvic bone has a lot of curves and dips to it, and so it may take some practice to know exactly where you want to go. But again, it doesn't matter what your skills are, you're going to come out with a fairly large piece of meat or roast that is the inside round. Then once we remove the inside rounds, why then we can attack the rump portion or the sirloin portion, and this would lay on top of the pelvic bone of the carcass, and so it's simply trying to find the shape and the curve of that bone and remove all of this muscle system. This is primarily the gluteus medius muscle that's on the carcass. So from the leg portion, we've developed several cuts of meat. The knuckle is one that we would like to remove and clean up even further. There's a cap muscle or a muscle that lays on top of this knuckle that if we take it off, we'll put that into trimmings, and then we get a very clean, very nice looking roast. The other thing that we need to remember is that we included that kneecap or patella, and to remove it before we cut it into meat cuts. Once we have done that, why then you can decide whether you want to keep it as a single roast, or whether you want to cut it into smaller portions and make smaller roast, or even you could cut steaks from it. And so it's probably a real advantage to make a roast out of the portion of the knuckle that tapers quite a bit. And then if you like to cut slices from the center portion of this knuckle, why then you can make some very lean steak items from it. This is the outside round, and one of the things that you can do for the outside round would be to remove the eye muscle from the round and separate those two individual muscles, especially if you're going to utilize them for steak or roast meat yourself. This item of meat, as well as the eye, are major muscles that many people will like to make into jerky. And so you could cut the outside round into smaller roast, but you may want to leave it as one whole piece if you're going to give it to a jerky processor, or if you can slice and make jerky yourself, why then you would need also to leave it in one whole piece so that you can get the individual slices for the production of jerky. Here we see the outside round, and there's some very heavy connective tissue on the one side of it, and you would need to make sure that you clean that off before you further process it. This is the inside round. Again, a fairly uniform muscle that we would want to clean off an outside muscle to it as well. Just make it up, clean it up, put some things in trimmings and make it a much nicer appearance in terms of making a roast item if you were so desired to do that. And then you end up with one major set of muscles for the inside round that are very clean and very lean in appearance. You could again cut the tapering portions and leave those as a roast, and then if you'd like some inside round steaks, this may be a cut of meat that could be more desirable for use for steak meat as far as the leg cuts go, and you could cut individual steaks from this area as well. The final cut of meat that's out of the leg portion is this top sirloin or the rump portion of the carcass. This cut of meat is fairly small in size and most of the times would probably end up in lean trimmings, but if you'd like, you can cut it into slices that again could be used for sliced steaks or sirloin slices. This particular cut should be more tender than some of the other cuts that are on the carcass, but again it's fairly small, and so many people may just put it in a trim. Once you've done that, why then the final portion of the leg can be boned out once you've removed it from the carcass, because once you start removing these bones, why then you lose all your connections on the carcass. And so simply follow along the leg bones and cut the meat away. And one of the things you'll see is that the cuts of meat in this area are very heavy in connective tissue. It's where the tendons hook up into the Achilles tendon in the lower part of the legs, and it's just not very desirable for cuts of meat. It'd be very tough, and so probably the best thing is put it in grinding meat and lean trimmings. The other part of the carcass that we're going to put into lean trimmings is that we can trim the thin muscles that lie over the top of the rib cage. We want to make sure that we take the stuff that's clean and sanitary. Oftentimes on the inside of the rib cage there's lots of dirt and filth and dryness from the deer that have hung for a while before you've done the cutting process, and so we're simply going to take the outside meat and we're not going to cut in between those individual rib bones, and we'll just leave that meat on the carcass, which will end up as waste. And so the important point is here that you're creating more lean trimmings for your grinding and sausage operations.